The private dining room on the 14th floor of the Fairmont Royal York smelled like money. Not in any metaphorical sense. It literally smelled like the kind of wealth that has been accumulating for generations. Aged whiskey, cedar wood paneling rubbed with beeswax, and something floral that cost more per bottle than most people's grocery bills for a month. The windows looked out over Front Street and Union Station, the great limestone arches lit amber against the January dark, and the CN Tower stood sentinel in the distance, indifferent as always to what was happening below it. Kezia Adler had worked the 14th floor for 8 months. She knew every table by its grain, every guest by their preferred pour, and every manager by their particular brand of anxiety. She was good at the job. Better than good, though she would never say so aloud, and she moved through the room with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned, early and at some cost, to make herself invisible. Tonight, the room had been reserved for a private dinner hosted by Callaway Group, one of Toronto's largest property development firms. 12 guests, 7 courses, a wine list that had been approved 3 days in advance by someone whose title was Senior Vice President of something Kezia had already forgotten. The kind of evening where the order of the fish course mattered enormously, and the conversation never once touched anything real. She had changed into her uniform in the staff room on the 2nd floor at 4:30, tucking the hem of her white shirt with the mechanical precision of someone who no longer thought about the gesture. In the mirror above the sink, she had caught a glimpse of herself and looked away quickly. Not from vanity, but because she didn't particularly want to see the version of herself that existed in this building. That version was competent and pleasant, and wore her dark hair pulled back severely from her face. That version smiled at the right moments. That version was not the person she had been 6 years ago, standing in a convocation hall in Halifax in a green gown, waiting for her name to be called. She picked up her service tray and went upstairs. The guests arrived between 6:15 and 6:45, in that particular way of powerful people who are never quite on time and never quite late. Kezia took their coats at the door. Heavy wool, cashmere, one dramatic fur-trimmed thing that she draped across her arm with the same expression she used for everything, and poured the first round of sparkling water without being asked. At the head of the table sat the man she had been briefed about by her manager, a compact, nervous person named Jill, who always smelled faintly of cigarettes. His name was Foster Aldgate. He was 49, third-generation money, the kind of man who had been told he was exceptional so many times, and from such an early age that it had simply calcified into fact for him. He ran Callaway Group the way a feudal lord runs an estate, with the absolute certainty that every person in his vicinity existed to serve some function in his story. Foster Aldgate was not, by any useful definition, a cruel man. He was something more insidious than that. He was careless. He had never in his life been required to consider the interiority of someone who poured his water. He was holding court at the end of the table, gesturing with his wine glass in a way that suggested the glass was merely an accessory to his point. The others laughed at the right moments. They always did. Kezia moved around the table with the amuse-bouche, setting each small plate with a slight turn so the garnish faced the guest. She had learned that detail from a chef she'd once worked under, who had taken the whole enterprise very seriously, and she had kept the habit, even though most guests never noticed. She was reaching across to set a plate near the far end of the table when Foster Aldgate's voice stopped. Not stopped completely, redirected. "Now there's a question," he said. She didn't look up. She set the plate. "We have a piano," he said, and he was speaking to the table now with the expansive ease of a man about to offer entertainment. A Steinway, actually. Gorgeous thing. completely wasted in this room. He gestured toward the alcove on the far side of the room, where indeed there was a Steinway Model B, its black lacquer catching the candlelight. It was used for private events on special request. Kezia had never heard it played. I had lessons as a boy, Foster continued. 12 years. Could play Chopin well enough to impress people at parties. He smiled. That's really all it's for, isn't it? Impressing people at parties. The table laughed appreciatively. A woman in a coral blazer whose name Kezia hadn't caught reached for her champagne flute. You should play something, Foster, she said. Oh, I'm years out of practice, but his tone suggested he could be convinced. I need a proper opponent, a duel. He looked around the table with theatrical deliberation. His eyes passed over the guests, then continued moving, and landed, with that particular carelessness, on Kezia. She had picked up 2 empty amuse-bouche plates and was turning to leave. You, he said. Do you play? The room didn't quite go silent, but it tilted. The way a room tilts when something is happening that isn't quite acceptable, and everyone is waiting to see whether to pretend it is. Kezia looked at him. His expression was pleasant, curious, the expression of a man who genuinely did not understand why the question might be strange. Behind him, through the window, the CN Tower blinked its slow red pulse. I did, she said. A long time ago. Oh, marvelous. He said it the way people say marvelous when they mean this is going exactly as I'd hoped. We'll have a little competition. Make things interesting. He turned to his guests. What do you think? What they thought was immediately apparent from the way they shifted in their seats. The particular settling of people who have been offered a spectacle. The woman in coral was already smiling. A man with silver-framed glasses leaned forward slightly. Gilles appeared at Kezia's elbow from somewhere. His face was doing something complicated. Mr. Aldgate, he said, I'm not sure that our staff... Don't be stuffy, Gilles. Foster waved a hand. It's a friendly competition. She can say no if she likes. He looked at Kezia again, and there was something in his look now, not malicious, but testing, in the way of a man who has always had the power to set the terms of every situation he enters. Can you play something? Anything? We'll each have a go and let the table decide. The room waited. Kezia thought of a lot of things in the space of 3 seconds. She thought of the walk home along King Street at 11:30 when her feet ached. She thought of the hospital in Dartmouth, the specific smell of its corridors, the way her mother had looked in the 3rd month when the treatments were not working. And Kezia had sat in the family consultation room and listened to a doctor explain what the next 6 months might look like, and understood, in that room, that she would not be finishing her 2nd year at the Schulich School of Music. She thought of the acceptance letter she'd received the following January for a graduate program in Toronto that she had not been able to attend. She thought of the particular small violence of potential that simply goes unused, not destroyed, just quietly set aside, year after year, until you aren't sure anymore if it's still there. She thought, you have no idea who you're talking to. She said, all right. Gilles pulled her aside in the narrow corridor behind the service entrance while the sommelier refilled glasses. Kezia. His voice was low and urgent and not unkind. You don't have to do this. I can tell him you're needed in the kitchen. I'm fine, she said. He's the kind of man who... Gilles stopped. Started again. He'll make it embarrassing if he thinks you're better than him. Kezia looked at her manager. He was a decent person, she had always thought. He worked too hard and worried too much, and occasionally stood in the hallway eating a croissant at 3 in the afternoon, with the expression of a man who had made different choices at 22. I know, she said. She went back into the room. Foster Aldgate played first, because of course he did. He settled onto the piano bench with the practiced ease of someone who has done this at many dinner parties, pushed back his cuffs, and launched into the opening of a Chopin nocturne. The E-flat major, Op. 9, number 2, the one everyone knows, the one that sounds impressive if you haven't heard many nocturnes. He played it well enough. 12 years of lessons will do that for you, even if 30 years have passed since. His tempo was slightly rushed in the middle section, and his left hand was heavier than it needed to be, and there was a place in the ornamentation where he simplified rather than playing what was written. But the melody sang, and the room was appropriately hushed, and when he finished and lifted his hands from the keys with a small flourish, the applause was genuine. He stood and turned to Kezia with a magnanimous gesture. "Your turn." She had been standing near the door. The 12 guests at the table were watching her with varying degrees of expectation, amusement, and something adjacent to pity. The woman in coral had a slight smile that Kezia had been cataloguing for the past 20 minutes. It was the smile of someone who finds the whole situation charming in the way that things are charming when they involve other people's discomfort. Kezia walked to the piano. She sat down and adjusted the bench. He had it too high, which was a choice, and placed her hands in her lap for a moment and looked at the keys. The Steinway was warm from the room. Someone had tuned it recently, which was good. She tested a few notes quietly, not a performance of testing, but an actual assessment, the way you check the weight of something you're about to carry. The room was very quiet. She began to play, not the Chopin. She had considered it for a half-second and discarded it. Playing the same piece would be a kind of argument she wasn't interested in having. Instead, she played the first movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, The Moonlight, which everyone in the room would recognize within 4 bars, but which is, when played correctly, with the right weight on the bass line and the right understanding of what Beethoven was asking for in the treble, something considerably more serious than a party piece. She played it correctly. The triplets in the left hand kept steady and dark, not decorative but structural, the foundation that holds the whole thing up. She let the right hand carry the melody without forcing it, without sentimentality, which is the hardest thing to do with that particular piece, because sentimentality is what people expect, and resisting it requires a kind of confidence that has nothing to do with technique. 6 bars in, she heard the room shift. It was a physical thing almost, the change in the quality of attention. The kind of quiet that is different from polite quiet, heavier, more complete. Someone put down a glass. She didn't look up. She played the development section the way her professor at Schulich had once spent an entire 45-minute lesson explaining, not as a climax, but as an inevitability. "It's not drama, Kezia," he had said, standing behind her with his arms crossed and his voice very precise. "It's logic. Emotional logic. You're not surprising anyone. You're showing them where they already were." She had been 20 years old then and had not fully understood what he meant. She understood it now. She finished the movement and lifted her hands from the keys. The room was very still. Foster Aldgate was standing near the window, his champagne glass hanging from 2 fingers, forgotten. He was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not anger, not quite, but something that had complexity in it. Layers of something working themselves out. The silver glasses man broke the silence first. He started clapping slowly, then with more conviction, and the rest of the table followed, and the woman in coral was clapping too, but her smile was different now. "Well," someone said. "Good Lord," said someone else. Kezia stood from the bench. She smoothed the front of her uniform apron. She did not look at Foster Aldgate. "Excuse me," she said. "I should see to the 2nd course." She walked toward the service entrance. She had almost reached it when his voice stopped her. "Where did you study?" She turned. He was still standing by the window. The room was very quiet again, but differently quiet, attentive in a way that had changed direction. "Schulich School of Music," she said. "Dalhousie before that." He processed this. She watched him process it, watched the recalibration happening behind his eyes, the way a person looks when they are adjusting an assumption that they hadn't realized was an assumption. "You're a musician," he said, not an accusation, more like a statement that was arriving late. "I was a music student," she said. Life intervened. He looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes without effort, which was its own kind of statement. "You're a better pianist than I am," he said. It was said simply with a directness that surprised her. She had been prepared for deflection, for the particular form of grace that wealthy men sometimes employ when they lose at something, the expansive congratulation that makes the winning feel like it was granted rather than earned. This wasn't that. "Yes," she said, "I am." A few people at the table inhaled. The woman in coral blinked. Foster Aldgate nodded slowly. "Why are you?" He stopped. She could see him editing himself, deleting the version of the question that would have been "Why are you working as a waitress?" which would have been rude, and arriving at something different. "What happened? My mother was diagnosed with cancer," she said. "I left school to help with her care. She's in remission now." The room had the particular texture of a space where something real has just been said. "I'm sorry," Foster Aldgate said, and then, more quietly, "How long have you been here?" "At the Fairmont. 8 months. And before that, various places. I worked in Halifax for 2 years, came to Toronto for..." She stopped. There was a graduate program she had not been able to attend. She had come to Toronto anyway, in the end, because the city felt like the shape of the future she had planned, even if the plan itself was gone. "For a change," she finished. Foster set down his champagne glass on the window ledge. He looked at the piano. He looked at her, and in his expression, beneath the recalibration, beneath whatever complicated arithmetic was occurring between who he had assumed she was and who she actually was, there was something that resembled, faintly, embarrassment. Not guilt. She didn't want his guilt, but something honest. Something that acknowledged the distance between how he had gestured at her across a dinner table, "You. Do you play?" and what had just happened. "Mrs. Adler," said a voice from the far end of the table. She turned. The voice belonged to a woman she had not paid much attention to during service. Mid-60s, white hair cut close, a dark suit that was expensive in the way that had nothing to do with display. She had not laughed at Foster Aldgate's jokes. She had eaten quietly and listened, and Kezia had registered her as the kind of guest who required very little because she already had everything she needed. Her name, Kezia would later learn, was Vera Calloway. The VC on the company letterhead. The reason there was a Calloway group at all. "You studied under Hartman," she said. Kezia looked at her. "You know his work." "I've been on the board of the Toronto Symphony for 12 years, Vera said. "Hartman was one of the finest pedagogy scholars of his generation." She paused. "He retired from Schulich in 2021. "I know," Kezia said. "I was in his last cohort." Something shifted in Vera Calloway's face. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of something that had been sitting slightly out of alignment and had now been corrected. "He used to say," Vera said slowly, "that he had 1 or 2 students in a decade who understood what the music was actually asking." She looked at Kezia for a long moment. "Are you still playing outside of?" A minimal gesture at the room around them. "I have a keyboard at home," Kezia said, "and I play at St. Andrew's on Sunday mornings sometimes." They were short a pianist. Vera nodded. "I'd like to give you my card," she said, "if that's all right." The room, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. The silver glasses man was watching with an expression that was openly curious now. stripped of the earlier performance of detachment. Foster Aldgate was looking at the middle distance, working something out. Jill appeared in the service doorway, drawn by the extended silence from a room that should have been mid-course by now. He looked at Kezia. She gave him the smallest nod that everything was fine, and he retreated. Vera Calloway reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and produced a card, cream embossed the weight of real stock, and held it out. Kezia crossed the room and took it. She looked at it for a moment. The name. The title. A direct phone number handwritten in blue ink below the printed line. The TSO has a development program, Vera said, for musicians whose careers were interrupted by circumstance. It's not widely advertised. She paused. I think you should know it exists. The silence in the room was of a completely different character now than it had been an hour ago. An hour ago, it had been the silence of a spectacle. Now it was the silence of a room full of people who had come to a dinner party and accidentally witnessed something they hadn't been prepared for. The particular quiet of encountering something true when you had expected to be entertained. Thank you, Kezia said. She slid the card into the front pocket of her apron. She looked once at Foster Aldgate, who was looking back at her with an expression that was not quite remorse and not quite admiration, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. I'll let the kitchen know we're ready for the second course, she said, and she went to do her job. She didn't call the number that night, or the next day. She put the card on the small table by the window in her apartment on Ossington Avenue, next to a library copy of a music theory text she had borrowed 3 weeks ago and not yet returned, and a photograph of her mother taken last spring outside the QEII hospital in Halifax, squinting into the sun and smiling in the way she smiled now. Carefully, like someone who knows the value of the thing, she made tea. She sat in her one good chair, outside the window. The city did what it always does at midnight in January, which is to say it kept moving, indifferent and bright and various, with its usual disregard for the small private moments happening in the lit windows stacked above its streets. She thought about what Vera Calloway had said, not about the program, though she would think about that too. Later, in the methodical way she thought about things that mattered. She thought about the other thing Vera had said, almost casually at the end. He had 1 or 2 students in a decade who understood what the music was actually asking. She had been 20 years old the last time someone said something like that to her about her playing. Then the hospital in Dartmouth, and the consultation room, and the particular arithmetic of what her family needed and what she could provide. And the long train of years since. Not unhappy years, not wasted years, but years that had been about other things. She looked at the card on the table. She thought about the room going still when she began to play. Not because she had won a contest, because she had done something real in a room full of performance, and the difference was audible, and people had heard it even when they hadn't expected to hear anything at all. The music doesn't go anywhere, her professor had said once. In a different context, whatever you do with it, whatever happens to you, it waits. Kezia reached over and picked up the card. She set it down again. Not yet. She finished her tea. She went to bed. In the morning she would call.